Devika? Hmm. Are we? Sir? Sir? I request the speaker of the day today, Professor Sonalde Desai, to kindly grace the dais. Ma'am? The discussant for today's lecturer is Professor John Reyes, visiting professor, Ranchi University. Request John to please grace the dais. The chairperson and the moderator for today's lecture is Professor Alakhen Sharma, Professor and Director, Institute for Human Development. Request you to kindly come on the dais. And I would request Professor Ramesh Saran, Professor and Director, Institute for Human Development, Eastern Regional Center, to kindly come on the dais. Good morning and warm greetings to all of you. I'm honored to welcome you all to the 10th IHD Silver Jubilee Lecture on Gloom or Boom, the Puzzling Trends in Indian Women's Labor Force Participation by Professor Sonalde Desai, Distinguished University Professor, University of Maryland, and Professor and Center Director, NCAER, National Data Innovation Center, New Delhi, being organized under the auspices of Institute for Human Development Silver Jubilee Lecture Series. I am Priyanka Tyagi. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. I am personally very thrilled that this lecture is taking place, and especially the IHD Silver Jubilee lecture is taking place in my hometown, Ranchi. Yes, I belong to Ranchi, and I'm extremely thrilled, ma'am, that you've agreed to deliver the lecture here. Thank you. And also thank you to all of you. I can see many people who have turned up on this Sunday morning to listen to this lecture. Thank you to all. As I just said, IHD is celebrating 25 years of its founding this year. The Silver Jubilee celebrations commenced on 25th January 2023 with a lecture by Professor Hajun Chang of SOAS London. This Silver Jubilee lecture is a part of several lectures, conferences, and activities of the year-long IHD Silver Jubilee celebrations to be concluded in March 2024, which will be during the ISLE conference at Telangana, Hyderabad. Just to list down under the series, this is the 10th in the series. We began, as I said, with Professor Hajun Chang of SOAS London. The second lecture was delivered by Professor Albert Park of ADB Bank. The third lecture was delivered by Dr. Sunita Narayan or Ms. Sunita Narayan of Center for Science and Environment. Fourth, by World Bank Chief Economist, Professor Indermit Gill. The fifth lecture by Nobel laureate, Professor Abhijit Banerjee. The sixth lecture was by Professor Francisco Ferreira from London School of Economics. The seventh lecture by Professor Thomas Pogge of Yale University. The eighth lecture by Professor Kaushik Basu of Cornell University. The ninth by Professor Deepak Nayyar. He is the IHD chairman and also former vice chancellor of Delhi University. This is the 10th one. Professor Sonalde Desai is here. The 11th one will be by Professor Maitri Ghatak of London School of Economics at Hyderabad on 28th, and the 12th. Yes, we are completing a dozen. On 30th, during the ISLE conference by Ms. Rama Bijapurkar, who's a known market analyst and an industry person. She's also a board member. And in this whole year, we've organized 3 international conferences. The first one was in July 2023, which was the International Conference on New Technologies and Future of Work in Global South. This was jointly organized by the Institute for Human Development, the International Labour Organization, and the Wits University, South Africa. The second, 20 days later, again an international conference, the second edition of the International Conference on Sustainable and Inclusive Urban Development in Global South, IHD, University of Florida, and Niti Aayog. And the third grand gala conference of where all the people in the world from human development assembled in Delhi, which was the Global Conclave 2024 on Advancing Human Development in Global South with Niti Aayog, RIS New Delhi, and IHD New Delhi. And ma'am was also part of our advisory committee. Thank you, ma'am, and that the conference took place. I would now invite Professor Ramesh Saran, Director of the Institute for Human Development, Eastern Regional Center, Ranchi, who has worked in the capacity of Vice Chancellor, Vinoba Bhabha University, Hazaribagh, Professor and Head of Department of Economics, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, Ranchi University, and a visiting faculty member at IIM Ranchi for several years. He has made significant contributions to research and teaching in varied areas such as tribal issues, social security, livelihoods, poverty, employment, labor markets, and related issues. So before I formally call upon Professor Ramesh Saran for his welcome and opening remarks, I would just like to thank all the participants for joining us here and also the online participants for their grand response. We received more than 600 registrations on Zoom. This is available live on YouTube. People who have joining us from Zoom, this is for them. I would request them to place the Q&A through the questions through the Q&A box. And people who will be joining live on YouTube may please engage with us in the comment box. So it is now my privilege to invite Professor Ramesh Saran for his welcome and opening remarks.
Good morning to all and Johar. I, on behalf of ISD, Eastern Region Center, welcome you all to this very important lecture. ERC is working in Ranchi. We have Eastern Region Center in Ranchi. We are celebrating 25th year of Silver Jubilee of ISD Delhi. ISD as an organization. We are a part of it. And this center is working almost for more than a decade. It has contributed a lot in terms of research on Jharkhand and Eastern region. We've been working on health, education, livelihoods. And recent food security atlases we produced, hunger mapping we did. So we have been working on all these issues which are very critical to this area. इसके अलावा we have been working, अभी तो हम लोग we are working on a very ambitious and a very important project of non-timber forest produce and how it can enhance the livelihood of the women, particularly the tribal women. We are working on it. And I'm happy to tell you that we have made a good progress into it. Number of interventions we did, and these are replicable, we feel. Others can understand the collectivization of the products non-timber forest produce and how it can enhance the family income of particularly of the tribal farmers and the people who are based on forest. This lecture, we requested Professor Sharma that so many lectures are being carried out to celebrate and commemorate the 25th, the Silver Jubilee celebrations. So let there be one in Ranchi. We wanted to have a conference also in Jharkhand on future of Jharkhand, because we'll be also starting our journey of 25th year of formation of this state. So we would like to see what is going to be the future, what has happened in last 25 years. But we could not do it. But we'll be doing it in, say, February next, all the elections and everything. We want to see that Jharkhand and Eastern region becomes a very vibrant center of economic center it should become. And I think with the help you have, with the blessings we have, and with the cooperation of all, we'll be able to do that. That is what we feel. We have a very important topic today, very important topic. There has been a question, there has been a puzzle And there has been, as what is happening, that in spite of the growth which we had, the growth, massive growth in GDP, in gross national product, we had a good growth period. We have broken the shackles of Hindu growth rate. In spite of that, why women participation is falling? That has been a puzzle. Why? Women participation in labor force is falling. Why? Professor Desai had chosen this very important topic. She is well versed into it. I will not comment on it. But this is a question. And this question has to be seen in many perspectives. Is it basically the income effect? Where the income of male rise, they put their females behind the doors to do the household chores. Is it that? Is it a substitution effect because of the technology that is changing? And women have so many problems of tradition and other social norms that they are being pushed out. Is it the substitution effect? What has happened to the elasticities of employment? If you look at 80s, we had the highest elasticity of employment as the output rose. Now what has happened that the elasticities are not rising. So even if you 1% rise in your income, now your employment does not rise in the same proportion. This is happening. And so we have unemployment. We have the data on NSS and PLFS for a longer period. And Professor Desai will talk about more about it. But these are the questions. Is the work environment not favorable for women? Is there any stagnation or what do we call it, retarded growth? If there is a stagnation of women education and women skills and women progression in the corporate and other sectors, there is a stagnation. Is there any, what do you call it, the future, the constraints which are there? Are there so many constraints for the women still, which are very traditional in nature? जो शुरू से हो रहा है अभी तक बहुत कठिनाइयां हैं क्या? क्या women के skills इतने अच्छे नहीं हैं? They participate into it. They are able to. What are the major constraints we have? What are the major solutions we have? What are the major things that have to become? Because we have seen that in the post-independence period there has been a rise in the literacy rates, huge rise in female literacy rates, a very low rate to still there are gaps increases, but skill gaps we have. That is well known if you look at the data. So all these things are issued to be seen. And what are the changes that have to be made? Changes in the corporate world. Because I heard and I was told that there is a paternity leave in the corporates. Now there is a concept of paternity leave. What is happening to that paternity leave, as was told to us, and I was reading one of the researchers. I found that that paternity leave is being used by male to get their training, to have vacations. They are not changing the nappies of the children. It is once again the women's work. So with the women's works, they have a double burden. Is it because of that? Recently, news just 2-3 days back, a news came that Bengaluru is suffering from water scarcity. Huge water scarcity. Who is losing their jobs? Who is trying to give up their jobs just to collect water? And it is the women, not the male. These are some of the very small trends, very small trends. But do they aggregate up to such broad macroeconomic data, which we have? We have to consider. Professor Desai will talk about it. And she has better understanding of it. She has been conducting researches on this. What has happened to so many programs and so many other things can happen. So once again, I welcome you all, especially all the academicians who have come here, all the students who have come here, all the press people, media, and especially our guests who have come here. John gave us a time. I'm very happy that John came to this. We wanted him to deliver the lecture, but John could not manage it. Then we have Professor Desai. We thank him. We also thank from Eastern Regional Center, Professor Alak Narayan Sharma for organizing this lecture. And for all of us, I think you'll enjoy this morning. Enjoy this, have questions. If you are able to put your questions, put your doubts, put your understanding, if you can, I don't know how much time we'll have, but I think we'll have some time. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Sharan. The director of the Institute for Human Development, Professor Alakhen Sharma, is a development economist who has made significant contributions to research in varied areas such as livelihoods, labor migration, poverty, employment, labor markets, political economy, and related issues. Professor Sharma is also the editor of Indian Journal of Labor Economics, the quarterly journal of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, and the Indian Journal of Human Development, a journal brought out by IHD and SAGE. The earlier one was with Springer and SAGE. He is presiding and moderating this important lecture. I hand over the reins of this session in your hands, sir.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Sonalde Desai, Professor John Reyes, Professor Ramesh Sharan, my colleague Priyanka Tyagi, and all of you. As my colleague Priyanka explained you about, in detail rather, about the Silver Jubilee celebrations of IHD, and Professor Ramesh Sharan just mentioned, Professor Ramesh Sharan and my colleagues here, we are very keen to have one lecture at Ranchi. And now that Professor Sonal Desai is here, I think we have got a very outstanding scholar in her to deliver this lecture. Her CV has been circulated to all of you. You must have read it. Short CV. Her CV, big CV is quite long. She is a leading demographer of the world, sociologist, demographer. She works both in India and outside. A PhD from Stanford and postdoctoral research from Chicago. She divides her time between India and United States. But her work on gender, nutrition, all these issues, population, demography, including women's workforce participation, is widely known. And this topic, about which Professor Ramesh Sharan just told, it is really some kind of puzzle, some kind of enigma in India. You must be reading in the newspapers, political discourse, that women's labor force participation is very low in India. In fact, even among developing countries, it is among the lowest. In except Pakistan and Afghanistan, in this region, and a few African countries, I think it is one of the lowest in the world. Bangladesh participation rate is much higher than India. We have participation rate of something like 25%. In recent years, after COVID, it has increased, though that increase has been questioned. This is in subsistence employment. Professor Desai will certainly emphasize. But women's labor force participation rate over the world average is around 57-58%. In China and West European countries, it is above 70%. So think of the potentiality of India. A large number of 75% of women don't participate in paid work. They may be participating in household chores and all that. And it has been estimated that if there is some rise, say 10% rise in women's labor force participation in India, in productive employment, productive jobs, India GDP will significantly increase. In neighboring Bihar, women's labor force participation is 7-8% as per latest labor force PLFS data. Jharkhand, it is higher. Traditionally, tribal women participation have been higher. Of course, there are several regions. Professor Desai will go. An important reason I attach importance to it, the measurement issues, the biasness of investigators and all that. Recently, we conducted 10 households survey data in Delhi, and we found that at least when women are asked the question and sufficient time is given, women's labor force participation increased by 6 to 7%. This is just 1 year ago. So but discrimination, gender, all these aspects are there. So this is really a very tricky issue, and there is no better person than Professor Sonal Desai to deal on this issue. She is also a member of the national, what is called, task force, or what this Apex committee on data?
Standing committee.
A standing committee, yes, a standing committee, statistics. She's a member of Government of India. So she knows the statistical system. And by the way, I don't know, many of you might be knowing, she regularly, every 10 years or 5 years, 5 years your data, Human Development Survey, 10. She brings out something called India Human Development Survey, around 40,000 households, and it is a unique panel data. And researchers all over the world use it. For PhD, for research articles, it is free, open access, and this is great service to the research world and policy. So based on her insights from human development surveys, which she conducts, and of course, official statistics, I'm sure her insights will provide you, all of you, a very, very good understanding of these puzzling questions. So I won't take much time. We have time till 1, but we can extend it to 15 minutes more. Lunch can wait since we have taken some time. But as long as you want, maybe 45 minutes, you can, then there will be question and answer. No, after her lecture, Professor John Ray will speak for 10 minutes as discussion, and then it will be open for discussion. You are free to ask question either in English or Hindi. Language is no. Professor Desai can understand Hindi and she can respond to it. So thank you. With these words, I invite Professor Sonalde Desai to deliver the 10th IHD Silver Jubilee lecture.
Because let me just help you. With here, it's easier. Professor Alok Sharma, Professor Sharan, Jean Dres, Priyanka Tyagi, and invited guests as well as friends on Zoom. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Sharma, for this very kind and generous introduction. You have always been more than generous to me, particularly when I was a very young scholar and beginning my career. There were very few people who were as generous and welcoming to me as you were. And so, you know, if you were to invite me to go to any conference, I would always say yes. But particularly coming to Ranchi has been a great pleasure because the topic on which I'm going to talk, I have more questions than answers. And I'm sort of hoping that being in a place like Ranchi with the kind of experience all of you in the audience bring will probably provide me with some more insights and answers than I can get sitting in Delhi, and certainly much more than what I would get sitting in Washington, DC. So thank you for the invitation. This is a topic on which I have really been puzzling over some time, largely because the data that we look at tends to be extremely contradictory. Okay? Uh, depending upon your perspective, the stories that we hear are very different. So I have two graphs, one showing data from National Sample Survey through 1987 to 2017-18, and the second graph from 2017-18 to 22-23. Okay. First one shows this fairly steady decline in officially recorded women's work participation rate. The other one shows this steady increase in women's work participation rate. Depending upon where you kind of come from, the story that you use to explain either the decline or the increase tends to be very different. If you are a pessimist, then the decline is sort of worded as, the sky is falling. Indian women are getting pushed out of labor force. The inclusive growth has been a jobless growth. Okay, so that's the story. And then when it comes to explaining the increasing labor force participation rate, the story goes, the poverty is pushing women into the labor market, and hence their labor force participation is rising. Now, if you're an optimist, you would say that household incomes are increasing, at least to explain the initial decline. Household incomes are increasing, and consequently, women do not need to be in the labor force, and that's leading to labor force withdrawal. When you try to explain the increase, the answer seems to be that, well, the labor market is growing, there are many more opportunities for women, and hence women are participating in the labor market. So it doesn't matter whether you're explaining the decline or the increase, depending upon your perspective, there is a very different story. Okay? How do we sort it out? Okay? Well, the one thing that might kind of be used is the famous U-shaped economic development and labor force participation curve that Claudia Goldin proposed. She argued that as long as the economy is an agrarian economy, there is a high female labor force participation rate because women can work on the farms. When the economy goes through a manufacturing phase, there will be a decline in female labor force participation because the manufacturing facilities, industries, etc., push women out, focus on male labor. And then when the service economy grows, okay, there will be space for women, and hence women return to the labor force. This is sort of her global experience. And if you looked at work participation rate for women from NSS or PLFS data, you can kind of look at it and say, yeah, we have a U-shaped curve. Well, that's the explanation, perhaps. The problem is that we don't quite look at in depth at where the decline took place and where the increase took place. So let me show you some data here. Okay, you'll notice that basically I have divided up women's labor force participation in three categories: wage work, self-employment, which is not agriculture, and self-employment, which is agriculture, which is either as a farmer or as a family helper. And I should tell you, I don't like the word family helper because unpaid family helper, I think women who work on farms are farmers, so I'm just going to call them farmers. But what you'll see is that the green bar, which is a green line, which is the wage work, and the brown or the orange line, which is the self-employment in other sectors, there hasn't been a lot of change. There is some change, of course, and we can talk about it later on, but there hasn't been a lot of change. The change that we see is in basically women's engagement on the family farms. Okay, it fell and it increased. Now, again, I have to tell you that there are more papers on women's labor force participation than probably there are data points. And one of the explanation that is often being given is that, men moved out of agriculture, so did women. And then men moved out of agriculture and hence women are taking over. Okay. And that's been kind of those couple of different explanations that are being given. But look, most of you who are working on the ground, the rapid increase in self-employment in agriculture between 2017 and 22-23, okay, the speed of it is such that there is nearly a doubling of the women's participation. That, does it sound believable? I mean, we are looking at a world in which if 5 years made such a big difference, farms have not been shut down. Land market is not such that there is a lot of buying and selling going on. Um, this kind of a transition would be very difficult to find because the women essentially are, it's the same cohort over the 5 years we are talking about. So this very rapid influx of women into agricultural family farms seems somewhat implausible. Now, Professor Sharma mentioned that I have been engaged in what is called India Human Development Survey. We have done 2 rounds of it in 2004-05 and 11-12, the same years in during which NSS was documenting a very rapid decline in female labor force participation rate. You should look at these red numbers here, 41.6 to 26.9. That's the NSS decline in the family-based work for women. Okay? IHD is comparatively actually shows much smaller decline, and even that disappears if we include taking care of animal, which should by legitimately should be included in the labor force participation. So, when we came out with this data, we basically felt that we must have made a mistake. Okay. After all, NSS is the gold standard by which we all try to live. And if we didn't record that decline, there must be something that wasn't quite right about the way we phrased our questions. So we were always very hesitant in presenting these results. Over the time, I started feeling that maybe we weren't picking up something that was anomalous. Maybe there was an issue with the way NSS was asking these questions. So, and this idea actually came to me when Renana Jhabwala and I were speaking after a conference, and she said, you know what? I don't know that NSS is picking up the women's labor force participation correctly because they are showing such a low labor force participation rate in Bihar. And there are so many more women in my experience who seem to be working. And I said, I wonder how NSS asks these questions and how does the IHDS ask, and does the way we word our questions has any effect? So we did this small experimental survey in Delhi National Capital Region, which had both urban and rural districts, because you go as far as Alwar, and then you have Noida, and so they're both rural and urban areas. And this was just designed to be an experimental study, okay, where all we were trying to do was understand how people perceive the questions that we ask. Right? So the first thing we do is when we go into any household, the question is very NSS-like. What is the primary activity status over the past 12 months? And for people who are involved in domestic duties, the next question is, is there any other activities that you engaged in for a period of at least 30 days? So you can pick up the subsidiary activity level. Okay. After that, we go out and do the fairly long household survey in which we ask them, do you have a farm? Who works on the farm? Okay. Do you have any livestock? Who takes care of the cow or the goat or whatever? Does your household engage in any kind of a small business, however small it might be? Then we would ask who works on it. Okay. And then we would ask who does any work for casual labor, salaried work, etc. So the way we ask is not asking the respondent to define what is the primary and secondary activity status. It's rather we go through this series of questions. And what our results showed was that there was a real change in the number of people who would get classified as being participating in the labor force, depending upon which definition we used. When we used the standard NSS definition, for women, which is the orange bars here, the number went from 28% to 32%. And then once we asked also about the animal care, the number went from 32% to 44%. Okay. So for men, there was very little difference. Okay, in fact, there was a point at which there was a slight decrease in men's labor force participation, okay, for depending upon the age group. So basically, I think what is maybe happening is that men's work is counted as work, regardless of how the questions are worded. Women's work is not counted as work, and often it sort of gets overlooked unless you find some way of asking it explicitly. And this very much jived with my field experience, because I remember at one point doing a survey in a village where in the same village we go day after day. And there was this little shop that a woman used to man where I would go and, find water bottle or candies or something or the other. Turned out that her household was selected for us to interview. And when we asked her, she said, "Oh, I don't work." Okay. And I said, "But every day I see you sitting on this shop." Okay. "No, the shop is owned by my husband. I don't really work. I just help him out." He was a teacher working in some other village. She was running it day, morning and evening, but she didn't see it as sort of the work that she was doing. Okay. So I think that the problem is in some sense how we ask the questions. Now, there is one additional issue with respect to the way NSS does it. Okay. And this is sort of what is called the NSS schedule that I'm just showing you. You can't read it, but it's just to give you a sense of the kind of grids that interviewers are expected to fill in. Okay. There is no clarity of question that is being asked. They're basically supposed to be filling out this form in which you write down what is the primary activity status of this person, what is the subsidiary activity status of this person. Now, I should say that historically, NSS interviewers were very well trained. They knew actually how to ask these questions, okay? They had a form in front of them, but they kind of would go there, they would talk to the household, they would get a sort of general information, they would know how to probe, and they could get the data fairly well, better than perhaps some of these well-worded questionnaires that we all use, the rest of us use, okay? The problem is that over time, as sort of systems around NSS changed, they moved from interviewers who were permanent hires, who regularly worked year after year and had a lot of experience, to a contract interviewers who would be hired for a limited period and did not have enough ability to get trained. The supervisory number also seemed to have fallen. There was a movement from standard Indian statistical services to subordinate statistical services. I think all this is very well described in a paper by Pramit Bhattacharya. So there is an unobserved effect of the way the data are being collected, which may well be shaping some of the things that we are seeing today. Okay. So what I want to do as we sort of go is look at some of the more stable aspects of this data. Before I kind of go into women's labor force participation, let me just show you the men's labor force participation from NSS and PLFS. And what you see is that there has been a relative stability in the kind of activities that men do. When we look at it year to year, yes, there is some change, and you will see there was a period in which men moved out of agriculture somewhat and moved into non-farm work and so on. But overall, there has been a fairly general stability out there. It's only when it comes to women that we are seeing some of these changes. And as I said, almost all the change is in women's self-employment. Okay. So what I would like to conclude on that area is that data quality changes create an impression of falling and rising female labor force participation rate, okay? Whereas underlying changes may be much smaller. But I think the crucial question for us to look at really is what's happening to women's participation in wage labor? Okay? And this is actually a very important question because over time, the household, given the stagnation of farm incomes, I think it's really some of the income increases likely to come out of access to non-farm work, wage labor, etc. And I think the focus, trying to understand it, would be very useful. Some of the things that we sort of need to think about when we look at women's wage labor participation, okay, is that India has seen tremendous social changes over the last 30 years. The first thing we all know is that education is expanded enormously. If you look at the ASAR surveys, virtually every child today is going to school. Okay, and even teenage girls and boys are still continuing to get enrolled in middle school and secondary school and so on. So the very famous gap between boys and girls, men and women that we used to talk about in education has been declining sharply. And what I'm presenting here is basically the ratio of female to male schooling for secondary and college education for women aged 25 to 59. For younger people, we would see even a much greater improvement. The second thing that has happened in India is there has been a rapid fertility decline. Okay? And what you see here are sort of comparisons from National Family Health Survey waves 1 and 5 of fertility rate for women at different levels of education. And as we can see, there has been a sharp decrease in fertility, particularly for the least educated women, but for everyone. Okay? And its impact then happens to be is that the number of years mothers spend taking care of their children has also dropped. Okay, so historically what we said was that it is women's childcare responsibility, and this expansion of research on care work, okay, argues that it's women's childcare responsibility which keeps them out of the labor force. Well, the childcare responsibilities are going down. Okay, it should lead to an expansion of labor force participation. Right? Similarly, education is increasing, and historically we think that higher education should lead to greater labor force participation. So there are all these things which are actually should be increasing women's labor force participation. At the same time, there are also some things that might be compensating, such as there may be a lower need due to higher family incomes, and there may also be lack of opportunities for educated women as women get educated. Okay? So we may have diverse pulls and push factors that are going on simultaneously. I'll just show you some data for a moment on incomes that IHDS, the survey that I talked about, is the only one which collects data on income. And what we do find is that there has been an increase in median income between 2004 and 2012 for both urban and rural areas. Okay. So I have two graphs for you that may be a little bit hard to read, so I will kind of explain them. The right-hand side, the big area graph, shows you the change in education for rural women aged 25 to 59. The green area, which is very sharply shrinking, is people who are either never went to school or have primary or below primary education. The brown bar is the middle school education, and the very light blue one is the college degree. The smaller bar chart on the left, which may be very hard to read for you, describes the labor force participation or the kind of activities that the women at different levels of education do. For women who are at below primary and below, the wage employment is the lowest bar is very small. The middle bar is self-employment in other areas, which is against in non-agriculture, which is also small. And the top bar is self-employment in agriculture, which is very high. Okay? As we go up the education ladder, the self-employment in agriculture or farming, farm work shrinks, wage work increases. Okay? And this is the rural story. The problem is that simultaneously there is a consistent decline in women's work participation because the loss of farm work is much larger than the gain in the wage work. Okay? And so there is a consistent decline in labor force participation for by education for women in rural areas. When you go to urban area, the stories are slightly different. Okay. In urban area, farm work was never very big. There is only very little farm work for kitchen garden or gardening type of a thing. Wage work is always the big kind of activity. And a self-employment in non-agricultural work, small entrepreneurship also is prevalent. So what happens is that for the women with very low levels of education, there is a wage work, which is mostly manual labor. It shrinks as they get middle school education. Okay. And then it increases as you go to college. Okay. So for urban areas, we have a U-shaped curve in which the least educated women are likely to be employed and the most educated women are likely to be employed. It's the middle group which has the lowest level of education. And then if you look at the compositional change, we can see where the growth has occurred, right? The green area, which is the below primary education, okay, has shrunk. The orange area, which is middle education, has grown, and the college has grown. So the balance of what happens to women's labor force participation is kind of balance of the which sector or which type of education growth is more predominant. So what we are seeing is, in some sense, a compositional change, which is sort of associated with education-related employment. So it's really the education and employment relationship that we really need to pay attention to. And that's what I'm going to turn on next. The relationship between education and employment is complicated by a number of factors. First thing is that educated women tend to marry educated men, and they often have higher income, which reduces their financial need for working, what Professor Sharan talked about, income effect. Educated women may also be more likely to invest in children. So they have fewer children, but they may be spending more time taking care of the children and teaching them and so on, which American sociologist Annette Laroux has talked about as intensive parenting or concerted cultivation. And from our own sociological research, Srinivas has talked about Sanskritization, that as incomes increase, education increases, women may withdraw from the labor force, which may be seen as a sign of upward mobility. The problem is that these are all these complex relationships that the labor force surveys do not allow us to explore. Okay? Neither the NSS nor PLFS give us very good data on the households, on other household members' incomes, and so on. NSS even gave some things. PLFS is somewhat quite limited in the other ancillary information that's available to us. So for my next set of discussion, I'm going to focus only on India Human Development Survey, which is just 2004, 5, and 11, 12. In more recent years, I'm sure changes have occurred, but even understanding that pattern could be very helpful to us. Okay. I think we need to also think about what are the broader changes that have occurred in the society over this period. Okay. First thing that has happened is that infrastructure has definitely improved. Okay. Roads, transportation, and a variety of other infrastructure facilities. There has been an introduction of MG and REGA, which provided both equal wages for men and women. And by now, it's really largely women who are working in NREGA. Okay. And also there have been some increase in opportunities in service sector. Okay. So in some sense, we are dealing with very complex dynamics, and we have to try and tease out what can we tell about what's happening for women's participation in wage work. So I'm going to, in order to understand that, I'm going to focus on India Human Development Survey. I'll just give you a brief background on what it is so that you know what I'm talking about. It is a nationally representative multi-topic panel survey It's panel design, so we go back to the same households time and again. We have a final round in the field right now. And we basically are able to, between the two rounds of 4, 5, and 11, 12, we managed to get 83% of the same households, and we added a few new households to refresh the sample. What I'm going to talk about today actually also is something where we took information from NREGA website to look at what was the, how much NREGA work was done in particular villages, to be able to sort of distinguish between high implementation and low implementation villages, to sort of understand what's happening, whether there are any differences in what's happening in these villages. So the basic way I'm going to present the data to you is I'm going to look at only women who are aged 25 to 59. These are ever married women. They may be currently married or not. I look at women age 25 and above because I just didn't want to deal with rising school enrollment and college enrollment, and it seemed prudent to look at the prime working ages. I control for things like age, education, husband's education, whether there were any children aged 0 to 5 and 6 to 15 in the household, caste, religion, income of other household members, excluding her own, okay? Place of residence, state of residence, whether household did any farming or not, and so on. I estimate logistic regression models, and which I'll present very simply for so that they can be very easily discussed. And they basically have interaction between survey wave and women's education. And what I do is I present something called predictive margins. It's basically what it means is that you're adjusting for everything else, keeping it at the mean level, okay? Education, income, place of residence, everything else is at the mean level. And the individuals differ only in their education level, to look at the outcome on their wage labor participation. This was a paper we published about in 2018, which I'm going to expand here. So this one basically showed that there was what we've looking at all kinds of work combined, wage works, farm work, everything else combined. There was a U-shaped relationship between women's labor force participation and their education. The least educated women were more likely to work, most educated women were likely to work. It's women in the middle who were left out. Okay. What I'm doing here is I'm only looking at wage work and then comparing what happened between IHDS 1 and IHDS 2 to see if there were any changes. This is sort of this basic presentation, and you'll see these graphs over and over again. So I just wanted to walk you through what I'm presenting so that, you know, when we repeat the graphs, I don't have to do that again. The blue line is 2004-5 IHDS 1. The red line, it is 2011 and 12 IHDS 2. These are not actual work participation rates. These are predicted probabilities of working in these areas if all other factors are held constant, okay? And that allows you to take into account the increase in husband's income, that allows you to take into account changing composition of women's education and so on, and just look at the trends over time. And what we see is that there is actually an increase in women's wage work over this 2-time period. And that increase is mostly for the least educated women and the most educated women. Okay. So it's a small change, but it's statistically significant and it's important. This is what we really want to understand and enhance through policies over time if we can. That was urban and rural areas combined. Now I'm separating out urban and rural areas. Okay? And the graph to your left is the rural graph, and graph to your right is the urban graph. And what you'll see is that in rural areas, we see an increase in women's labor force participation at pretty much all levels, both at the lowest and at the highest education level, also a little bit in the middle. In the urban areas, what we are seeing is mainly the improvement for the least educated women. Now, urban growth is not surprising, right? I mean, urban areas have expanding job opportunities, people take advantage of it. It's the rural growth that is kind of interesting, surprising, what's happening. Okay? And I'd like to sort of trace it out through comparing different types of villages in which these changes are occurring to understand, where the change might be and why it might be happening. Okay. So what are the drivers of change? Now, there is considerable debate about what is holding back Indian women from participating in the labor market. Two major explanations have been proposed, that basically there are no jobs. Okay, where are women going to work? If there are no jobs, they can't be in the labor market. And there is some legitimacy to it. After all, if you have class 8, 10, 12 education, and you're a man, you can do a variety of things even in rural areas. You can be a mobile repairer, you can be a postal service postman, you can be driving a truck. Many of these jobs are not open to women. They can be either laborers or they can be ASHA workers, but the in between is kind of hard to find. But then the second explanation that has become very prevalent nowadays and quite popular, even when the job opportunities expand, we have cultural norms and social norms that will not let women take advantage of it. And that it's basically, we have to work on changing India's cultural and gender norms that will make jobs, women participate in the labor force. So normally we would expect both to be very acute in rural areas. So I think let's focus on rural areas in the next part of the discussion. Okay. So what's happened in India? And I think I'm focusing right now between these two survey periods, but a lot of it has been continuing on. So, it's not stopped. The world didn't stop in 2012 just because I stopped collecting my data in 2012. A lot of things have happened since then. It's just that I can only talk about the period for which I have the data. First, MGNREGA was introduced. So our data was collected in 4-5, and by 11-12, it was well established in a variety of areas. It's supposed to be guaranteed work for 100 days, but as Jean will very passionately tell you that it's really not implemented in a way where it's available to everyone. The number of days of work that's available is actually quite limited in practice. Okay, and a lot of things go into it, which I think you all understand better than I do. Okay, so what I did was I divided up the survey data villages that we have in how much NREGA work was done in these villages, and how much work was done comes out of the NREGA website, because we sort of painstakingly matched every village that we have with the number of days of work that was given, done in that village, divided it by the number of households in the village to give us average number of days that were given in these villages. And I have just differentiated between high and low NREGA wages work, but the high work is only 15 days per household on average in that village. Okay? And that's how I sort of divided up. We can maybe go through other dividing lines, but it won't make a huge difference. What we find is that in villages in which there was a very low level of implementation of NREGA, the labor force, the blue and the red line, although it looks to you as if the red line is slightly higher than the blue, is more or less overlapping statistically. And there has been some growth, but not a huge amount of growth. When it comes to the high NREGA implementation villages, we see actually fairly substantial growth for women at the least educated levels. For the other women, it doesn't make a huge difference. Okay? So what we do see is that there is an increase in women's wage work participation in villages where NREGA work is being done fairly well. Okay? And it's pretty much applies to the women at the lower end of the spectrum. The second area that I am going to look at is expansion of roads. Okay? Now, historically, of course, we all know, and you probably know it better here than in other areas, that there has been poor accessibility with dirt roads that got often clogged in monsoons. There has been a big push on improving the road systems, particularly over the last 10 years, but even going back much farther. Okay? It's just that when we were doing our surveys in 2004, 5, and 11, 12, the road connectivity was still poor in some areas, so which allowed us to sort of differentiate between villages which have pakka road that is functional 12 months and villages which don't have those pakka roads. And what you find is that the growth of women's wage work in roads which, in villages which don't have pakka work, which is again the left panel, okay, happened for women at the lowest level of education, partially perhaps because things like Narega were being done close by, okay, but not for women at very high levels of education, because they basically were restricted to finding work within their own villages. And there wasn't a whole lot of work that was available for women with 10th, 12th college degree. Okay. In areas which had pakka roads, okay, there was a much greater increase in women's work participation or participation in wage work. And that was particularly high for women with middle level of education, post-secondary education, college education, and so on. So we have had two things that have been going on simultaneously in rural India. For the least educated, there has been an expansion of Narega work where it's available. Okay. And for the most educated, there is an expansion of road networks, which allows them to take up jobs in nearby towns. For men, absence of transportation may lead to a long distance migration. For women, it often doesn't happen. So what they engage in is a short distance commuter migration, where they continue to live in their own homes in the villages and go to the nearby towns to work as salespeople, teachers, whatever else is available. Okay. So what I'm trying to point out, okay, is that changes have been taking place, and changes have been taking place in very specific niches. So what about restrictive cultural norms? After all, we are being told, okay, that cultural norms in India are so patriarchal that there is a reluctance on part of the families to allow their women to go out and work if the family can afford to keep them home. Okay. Let me first say that whatever especially one of the things that often gets talked about is, areas which are dominated by pallu or parda or ghungat, okay, are particularly restrictive, and women, who are doing pallus will not be participating in the labor force. Here are a couple of women from Haryana who are perfectly carrying away these huge head loads in spite of the fact that they're covering their faces. Okay. But the question that is, and I do understand that cultural norms do make a difference. After all, we have seen high labor force participation in South and low in North. Okay. But the question that is more important is, are these sort of so ingrained norms that they won't change, or are these areas also changing? Okay. And what I've done here is, and this is very crude work, so I apologize for the crudity of my classification here. But what I did was I classified villages based on districts in which there was a very strong practice of pallu or ghungat versus villages that are located in districts where very few women practice pallu or ghungat. And I classify those as more and less restrictive gender norms. And what we find is that the left-hand side, it's true that there has been a bigger change in areas where the gender norms are less restrictive. But even in areas which have restrictive gender norms, we still see an increase in women's labor force participation in wage work. Okay. So I think what I'd like to sort of say at this point in time, and this is kind of my last slide, okay, is that when we look at aggregate level, it feels like nothing's happening. It was like, the swan that's sort of gliding on the water and yet it's paddling furiously underneath. Okay, so there are a huge sets of changes that are happening. Some of them are contradictory, and hence we feel that nothing is happening. Okay, but where job opportunities increase, women do take advantage of it. Okay, and that what we need to do as a society is to be able to identify what can be done to increase the opportunities for women and to ensure that they live in conditions which are safe and secure and are able to participate by taking advantage of these opportunities. Transportation needs to be safe. Job opportunities need to be created in sectors which are not so exclusionary that women can't participate in it. So there will be a lot more thinking about the labor market transformations that will need to be done. But all I can tell you is that neither the boom, nor the gloom story is particularly relevant. I think a lot of it is sort of a measurement issue. At the same time, I think that there are changes that are taking place in Indian society, and we need to pay more attention to figuring out where, how, and how best to take advantage of it. Thank you.
Friends, all of you, I hope you will agree with me that this was a very insightful lecture. Her canvas was very large, but within that large canvas, with her own surveys, human development surveys, she showed a lot of insights. And many of the puzzles which are associated with the women's labor force participation, she have been able to explain. So all of us have been enriched. So thank you, Professor Desai, for this enriching lecture. So Joe, now your comments and remarks.
I add my voice to Alex's voice in thanking Sonal for a very wonderful lecture, very insightful and interesting on a very important topic. I'm not particularly knowledgeable on this topic. I'm not sure why I've been asked to discuss it, but I'll just offer some remarks from a common sense point of view. You may have noticed that there was a change of focus between the first part of the presentation and the second part based on IHDS data and the first part based on NSS, PLFS, and so on and so forth. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the first part was mainly about what we call women's labor force participation, including all forms of recognized labor. Second part was about what you call wage employment. Okay, I think that distinction is important, but I think the really important distinction actually is, the important thing to focus on, in my view, is not what we call women's labor force participation, which I think is a very misleading entity, nor wage labor employment alone. It's gainful employment, including self-employment where you earn some income. For example, a street vendor, and there are many of them, would be having a form of gainful employment without necessarily being a wage employee. I think probably the patterns that you have shown, if they were extended to gainful employment, it would be similar. So in that sense, I think we have more or less seen the right picture. But I want to explain why this is, I feel, the important thing to look at. When we talk about the economy, we're actually talking about two economies. There's the market economy and there's the domestic economy. Domestic economy in economics, we virtually don't talk about. It may actually be more important than the market economy, at least from certain points of view, because it is in the domestic economy that some of the most important things of life happen, like the education of children, food, health, emotional life, all these things that matter for the quality of life. But we basically ignore all that and we focus mainly on the market economy outside the household. Now, when we talk about, so let me complete that. So the consequence of ignoring that domestic economy is that we don't really have very good concepts or very good indicators to look at it. For example, what kind of work women are doing. For example, it's an odd thing, think about it, that if women look after buffaloes, they are counted as employed. And if they are only looking at children, taking care of children, then they are not counted as part of the workforce. It's very strange. So the consequence of that, I think, is that when we look at so-called women's workforce participation, based on the restricted definition of what work means, excluding, for example, childcare, we don't really know very well what we are looking at. And these trends from the first part, in particular, the declining trend of women's workforce participation, I think it's actually a little misleading. What seems to have happened, according to this data, is that women's employment in agriculture has declined, and that has not been compensated by other work or other recognized work. Now, we all know that actually Indian women, and especially rural women, work really hard. They are conditioned to work most of the time. And you can be sure that most of these women who have withdrawn from agriculture, possibly because the land holdings are shrinking or there's some mechanization and so on, you can be sure that they are not sitting at home reading the newspapers. They are doing something else in the domestic economy. And if we were able to define and measure that better, probably we would see quite a different trend. Okay, so that I feel is not necessarily very helpful to look at, or at least we don't really have the proper indicators to look at. So what is our concern? I mean, it's true, workforce participation is very low in India in international perspective, no doubt about that. But what is our concern? It's not that women are not working. You know, women are working very hard in India, possibly harder than in most other countries. That's not the issue. One issue could be that we feel that they can do more productive work if they were busy doing things that we recognize as workforce participation. Very doubtful idea, I think. I mean, it's not at all clear to me that a woman who is involved in the formal economy is necessarily more productive than a woman who takes care of the household. I think the concern, at least for me, the concern is this, two things. One is that when women work outside the household and they have some gainful employment, because this is gainful to me is the important thing, they are less economically dependent on men. They have more independence. I think that is critical because I feel that the main source of gender inequality and subjugation of women in India and exploitation and oppression is the economic dependence of women on men, the fact that they have no property, no paid employment, little family support after marriage, until recently not much education. So they're basically at the mercy of their husbands. When they have gainful employment, that changes quite drastically. And the second point is that when they have gainful employment and they work outside the household, they become part of society. They have a chance to contribute not only to the economy, but to politics, to social change. They're not just sitting at home making rotis and so on. So that's why I feel the important thing really is gainful employment. Now, if we were to look at gainful employment, I think probably we would see the same kinds of patterns that you've seen when we look at wage employment. So it may not be actually very different for practical purposes. But I think conceptually we have to be clear that this is really what matters most. Now, in the future, my guess is that women's participation in gainful employment, which is atrociously low in India. That has already been mentioned, but quite amazing. If you look at this, a survey that you've not mentioned is the Time Use survey of 2019. There's some dramatic information there on the minuscule amount of time that most women spend in paid employment or gainful employment, and virtually nothing. So that is certainly a major issue. I think it's going to change in the future, not maybe the very near future, but in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I think the data you have presented is consistent with that expectation, because it shows quite clearly that the more urban and educated women tend to have significantly higher rates of employment, of gainful employment. So I think that is going to increase. But I think we have to do something to accelerate that trend. to make it easier for women to be gainfully employed. And by the way, when I suggest that gainful employment is empowering, that actually depends a little bit on what kind of employment you're talking about. It is conditional on some reasonable work conditions and wages. Because if it's just exploitative labor, like domestic work at abysmal wages, with poor, bad treatment, making your health worse than it would be otherwise, then it may not be empowering. So we have to do something to accelerate the impending increase in gainful employment and improve the quality of gainful employment. Now, I don't have a lot of time to talk about what we can do about this, and I don't, as I said, I'm not particularly knowledgeable, but I think some things that we could do, just like thinking aloud, I think the technology of domestic work has to change. I mean, one reason why it's difficult for women in India to work outside the house is that there's so much work to do at home. You know, the men want their hot rotis 2 or 3 times a day. You can't just give them a sandwich or something. And there's a lot of work, I think, I'm guessing, in laundry. I mean, look at, if you have a family of 5 or 6, they all, every day they want to wear nice, clean clothes. And who is doing all this washing of clothes? It must be women or girls. So if we had, better cooking technology, including pressure cookers, which I still don't see that much among the poorer households, which even though it really saves a lot of time, cheap washing machines that relatively poor families can use to reduce the burden of household work, that sort of thing. And of course, more participation of men in domestic work. I mean, that's again a domain where India is among the worst performing countries in the world. Then better work conditions for women in general, more safety, sanitation, transport, making it easier. Recently, some states have introduced free transport for women, free public transport. I think that's a good initiative. Makes it easier for women to go out of the house. Other things of that nature could be done. A big expansion in frontline women workers in the field of education and health. There are already quite a few. They are doing wonderful work at very low cost. I mean, when you look at think of the ICDS program, which employs probably more than 30 lakh women, I think, doing very critical work in the field of childcare. It costs less than 20,000 crores of rupees. I mean, it's nothing actually for a huge army of women who are doing very, very critical work, benefiting tens of millions of children, hundreds of millions actually. So I think we need more of these frontline health workers, childcare workers, in education also, more women teachers. We can have an employment guarantee act for women. There's some talk now of sorry, did I say urban employment guarantee? I mean urban employment guarantee. There's some discussion whether if there is an urban employment guarantee, which is now being discussed more and more, whether it should be focused on women or not. I'm quite in favor of, initially at least, focusing on women only. Not only the workers, everybody, in the whole program being run by women, for women. Because I think that it will be an opportunity to have very creative schemes that facilitate and promote women's employment, including, for example, better transport facilities, sanitation, safety, and so on and so forth. So, of course, ultimately, I would like employment guarantee to be extended to everyone in urban and rural areas. But I think starting with women in urban areas may be a very good thing to do. So these are so there's a lot of things I think that can be done, and I'm very glad that Sonal's work and the work of others who are working in this field is helping us to think about these things and to give them more attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your very insightful comments. Now, your comments, questions, any clarification, as I have said in the beginning, you can ask in Hindi or English, whichever language. So please go on. And later on, we will take question online. But first, people who are in the audience. Yeah. And introduce yourself. Introduce yourself.
Good morning, ma'am. Very warm good morning to everyone here. I'm Dr. Anjali Srivastav, Assistant Professor from Sarla Birla University, Ranchi. Ma'am, I have a question. Actually, there is two questions. Both are correlated. The first question is, I also saw that in your slide that nowadays educated women, economically educated women tend to marry somebody who is educated enough and who is to reduce the financial needs. But in the research that I was reading previous day, it has shown that every pregnant woman, 17% of women tend out to walk out from their workforce when they are pregnant, and only 15% of them, they tend to remain at home, and the difference join the workforce. Why is that? And this is my first question. The other question is, when we see the same graph in the rural areas, every woman who gives birth to a child, occasionally after 6 months or 4 months, they are back to the farms. Why is that difference?
Any other question? Yeah, we'll collect 3-4 questions and then she will respond and then second round. Yeah, go on. Take the mic, please.
Yeah, very good afternoon. I'm Madhvi, and here, sir.
Yeah.
I'm Madhvi, and I'm an HR officer in Ekjut. It's an NGO which works towards maternal and child health development. So, my question is like, when our society talks about equity, and the government has, put many schemes for women empowerment. So it took 3 decades, as you mentioned in your slides. It took 3 decades, almost 3 decades, to realize that women could be the part of society. They can be involved in labor workforce. And what about the next phase? How many decades would it take to, finally achieve the equity level?
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Mamta Kumari, Coordinator, Women Studies Center, Ranchi University. मैम, जो स्टैटिस्टिक्स दिखाया गया जिसमें एनएसएस का डेटा था जिसमें 41.6% डिक्लाइन था वर्कफोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन, विमेंस वर्कफोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन। तो जबकि आपका डेटा, इंडियन ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट का डेटा कुछ और कह रहा है। तो मेरा यहाँ पे कंसर्न ये है कि वर्क का डेफिनेशन तो हमने चेंज नहीं किया है, ना ही अप्रोच टुवर्ड्स विमेंस लेबर चेंज हुआ है। लेकिन अगर ये डेटा इस तरीके से आ जाएगा, एनएसएस ज्यादा दिखा रहा है, आईएसडी कम दिखा रहा है, राइट? तो ये क्या थोड़ा सा डेंजरस नहीं है कि फिर तो गवर्नमेंट एजेंसीज इस डेटा को यूज करना ज्यादा प्रिफर करेंगी टू शो कि इतना वर्क फोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन है विमेन का, हम थोड़ा प्रोग्रेस कर रहे हैं, जितनी बात हो रही है कि इंडिया इतना पिछड़ा है उतना है नहीं। तो क्या इस मैनिपुलेशन के चांसेस नहीं है?
Good morning, ma'am. Myself, Kanaya Mahanti. I am a research scholar from Central University of Jharkhand. So during my PhD work, I conducted study on co-preneurs across 6 districts and 147 villages. In that, I found out that both husband and wife, those who are operating a business, maybe farm as well as non-farm, they state that, in that I found out that women, they have more working hours, they participate more in the business. But when I asked them who is the primary operator of the business, they said that it is their husband. Possible reason could be maybe they do not get the recognition. So what are the ways that we could provide official recognition to these co-preneurial women, particularly in rural areas of Jharkhand? Thank you.
We'll take one question in this round more. Yeah, go. Yeah.
नमस्कार, मैं किरण हूँ, डॉक्टर किरण। अभी रिटायर्ड पर्सन हूँ। आई बिलीव एवरीबडी इज कंफर्टेबल विथ हिंदी, तो आई कैन स्पीक इन हिंदी। मेरा सवाल आपसे और खुद से और यहाँ उपस्थित सारे लोगों से है। सवाल ये है कि जब हम कहते हैं कि औरतों से पूछते हैं कि आप क्या करती हैं, उनका जवाब होता है कुछ नहीं, जबकि एक परिवार की बुनियाद वो औरत होती है और उस परिवार में जितने लोग काम करते हैं उन सब का जीवन उसके ऊपर आश्रित होता है, तब भी वो कहती है कुछ नहीं। दूसरी बात ये कि पानी की समस्या, रमेश शरण जी कह रहे थे बेंगलुरु की बात, क्या हम अपने संथाल परगना में जाते हैं जहां पानी लाना औरतों का ही जिम्मा होता है, तो क्या पानी केवल औरतें पीती हैं, घर के और लोग नहीं पीते हैं? लकड़ी लाना औरतों का काम होता है, तभी जलेगा तो खाना बनेगा। खाना बनाना औरतों का काम होता है, जब तक खाना नहीं बनेगा तब तक घर के लोग खाएंगे नहीं। तो ये जो कुछ सवाल हैं वो मैं आपसे पूछ रही हूँ या अपने से पूछ रही हूँ, मुझे समझ में नहीं आ रहा, लेकिन क्यों है ये बात हम लोगों के लिए आज बहुत महत्वपूर्ण हो जाता है। और साथ में एक बहुत बड़ा गैप है हमारे सोसाइटी में, इस गैप को हम कैसे फुलफिल करेंगे? हम शहरों की बात करते हैं तो हम अपनी बात करने लगते हैं, जब हम गाँव की बात करते हैं तो एक ऐसी औरत की बात करने लगते हैं जो इतना नहीं समझती कि वो कितनी ताकतवर है, जो इतने लोगों का जीवन चला रही है और उसकी हर एक एक्टिविटी पे लोगों का जीवन आश्रित है। तो मेरा अनुरोध इस पूरे सभागार में उपस्थित सारे लोगों से है कि एक बार अपने मन को खंगालिए और ये सवाल खुद से कीजिए कि औरतें कितनी एम्प्लॉयमेंट में हैं या उनके एम्प्लॉयमेंट का गेनफुल यूटिलाइजेशन कितना हो रहा है और उसको हम काउंट कितना कम कर रहे हैं। धन्यवाद। Second down, now second down. Don't worry, everybody will get done.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I am Dr. Devika Modi, and I am an associate fellow with IHD. I just wanted to ask you, ma'am, since we are talking about labor market transformation, so will a change from men-centric jobs to women-centric jobs also change the narrative that we are talking about? Like, for example, in Ranchi, what we've started in very few areas is the pink auto service, which is run by women for women, which is making maybe safety better for women to maybe go from one place to the other, and also providing a kind of employment to the women. So will this narrative from men-centric jobs to women-centric change this narrative of women labor force market numbers?
Yeah. So there are 6 questions we will respond to. After that, we'll come to second round.
मैं सबसे लास्ट क्वेश्चन से पहले चालू करती हूँ. So I think that you're on the spot. Perhaps I would use a slightly different language, but I mean exactly what you're saying. Ki basically there are jobs which we see as men's jobs. Okay. And what it does is it keeps women out of those areas. So the number of jobs that are available to women get much more limited. And we really need to find a way of saying that, women can do most jobs. Okay. Perhaps do all jobs. Okay. Why can't we be open-minded about hiring them? One of the things that have struck me is that this is something we should be asking the government, okay? Not quota for women, but show us that you are not discriminating against women in the jobs that you are hiring them as. Because how come government cars don't have women drivers, right? So I think the idea of sort of making sure that certain occupations are not closed to women will increase their labor force opportunities and might make a huge difference. Dr. Kiran, I think आपका क्वेश्चन बहुत सही है कि महिलाओं के लिए बहुत उतनी ड्यूटीज होती है, पानी लाओ, लकड़ी लाओ, जो भी घर का काम होता है. एक जमाने में इंडियन वुमेन्स मूवमेंट कहती थी कि हमें जो बदलना है वो इट इज डोमेस्टिक ड्रजरी. वो जो काम है जो टेक्नोलॉजी से कर सकते हैं, जैसे जो भी कह रहे थे कि जो काम आप टेक्नोलॉजी से कर सकते हो, जो जिसके लिए आप बेटर इम्प्लीमेंट से उनका ऊपर बर्डन कम कर सकते हो. लेकिन व्हाट वी हैव आल्सो फाउंड इज that when women are earning, okay, households are willing to invest in these technologies. When women are not earning, they're not willing to invest. So the income for women, when it goes up, there is a greater likelihood that they will pay for kerosene or for LPG gas. Okay? When income is not increasing for women, but it's increasing for the men, okay, the expenditure is in some other fields. So I think there is a chicken and an egg problem, but nonetheless, both need to be solved. Okay. Basically, I think there was a very interesting question on how do we provide recognition how do we provide recognition when men and women are working together and in the household, either business or on farm? I think that I actually would love it to begin with is take out the word the family helper from our NSS data collection definition. Let's just talk about people as being worker in the same business and the same farms, not being helper. But the other thing that I think that there have been efforts at doing, like, land titling in the name of women, business titling in the name of women. So perhaps some of those things would also be helpful. Then I think there was a question from Mamta Kumari that basically would using different data sets make it dangerous? Frankly, forget about our data. You don't need it. The current data that is being available out of the NSS and PLFS is showing you that women's labor force participation is zoomed up. Okay, so that is what is basically being touted by the current dispensation. So I don't think it's a question about what data, what is dangerous. It's a really question about the narrative. And I think we need to be carefully looking at the narrative and studying it and making sense of it in some sensible fashion. Okay. On equity, 3 decade ho gaye, kitne decade lagenge? Okay. Really good question. I don't think anywhere in the world we have seen a total equality yet. So if I had a model, I could tell you where we would get to. We don't. But I must say though, that there are areas in which in India we have had tremendous equality as well. Okay, Indian independence movement is one of the best examples of the way in which sort of women were involved in civic engagement. So I'm very hopeful that, this kind of conversation is exactly what would lead to a change. Okay. And there was I think, couple of last questions. Okay. Just one question actually, which was pregnant women and, what can be done in terms of making sure. I think this remains a challenging question. Maternity leave is certainly something we all talk about and is important. At the same time, I think that for women who are working in informal sector, okay, there really are not very many options in terms of paying for this maternity leave.
Thank you. So now I will request some men to also ask questions. So one person who have been persistently raising hands, and he also. And then that's yes, coming to that. So since men who
नमस्कार मैम, मेरा नाम चंदन है। मैं एक प्रतिज्ञा नाम की संस्था में काम करता हूँ। तो आपने मैम ड्राइवर्स ऑफ चेंज पे जब बात कर रहे थे, तो यू मेंशन दैट देयर इज अ नीड ऑफ चेंजिंग कल्चरल एंड सोशियो नॉर्म्स एंड देयर वाज आल्सो यू मेंशन दैट एजुकेशन में बहुत ज़्यादा मतलब जो मैं समझ पाया कि एजुकेशन में भी इंटरवेंशन हुआ है, तो बट ऐसा कुछ महिलाएं हैं जो बिल्कुल नहीं पढ़े और फिर हायर एजुकेशन में वहाँ पर इम्पैक्ट है, पर मिडिल में नहीं हो रहा है ज़्यादा। तो अब अगर मैं if I want to start changing these cultural and social norms and connecting it to the education, how would you suggest to go ahead?
नमस्ते मैम। तो मैं हिंदी में बोल रहा हूँ। तो जो डाटा देखा हो, मैं डॉक्टर अमरुष महतो, आर्टिपोल मशरूम ऑफिस प्राइवेट लिमिटेड के मैनेजिंग डायरेक्टर हूँ। तो मैं ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा महिला लोग के लिए काम कर रहा हूँ, हैंड होल्ड कॉटेज इंडस्ट्री के लिए और मशरूम फार्मिंग के लिए। तो मैं एमएसएमई का अंडर में उन लोग को उद्यम रजिस्ट्रेशन बना दे रहा हूँ। तो वो पोर्टल में हम लोग देख रहा है, मैं अभी तक उसको 200 से ज़्यादा महिला लोग को उसको रजिस्ट्रेशन बना दे चुका। लेकिन प्रैक्टिकल ग्राउंड में देखा हुआ है मैं, वो 120 महिला लोग वो हैंड होल्ड कॉटेज इंडस्ट्री बना के उसको रोजगार कर रही। लेकिन उसके बाद जो रजिस्ट्रेशन हो चुकी वो भी पोर्टल में गवर्नमेंट का पास चला जा रहा है। तो ये कैसे मिलेगा मैम, ये मेरा पूछना है।
सर, मैं डॉक्टर ज्योति प्रकाश रांची विश्वविद्यालय में असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर हूँ मैडम जहाँ तक मैं सही हूँ तो आपने एक्सक्लूड किया है पॉपुलेशन ग्रुप में 15 to 24 years ऑफ एज, आप उनको ट्रीट कर रहे हैं एज स्टूडेंट्स। क्या 15 से 24 साल के सारे लोग स्टूडेंट्स ही हैं? अगर झारखंड के संदर्भ में हम देखें तो आप देखेंगे कि हमारे स्टूडेंट्स पढ़ाई के साथ साथ गेनफुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट में दे आर इन्वॉल्व। तो मुझे लगता है कहीं ना कहीं सैम्पलिंग मेथड्स में हम लोग थोड़ा कॉम्प्रोमाइज कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि वी आर इग्नोरिंग ऑलमोस्ट 1/4 ऑफ द टोटल पॉपुलेशन। करीब करीब 25 से 26 करोड़ है हमारी जनसंख्या 15 से 24 साल के। तो मुझे लगता है कि somehow we are compromising with sampling design. Thank you.
I am Dr. Anwar Hussain. I am an advocate in the Ranchi High Court. My question is that we talk a lot of things that the women are working hard. They are doing a lot of domestic chores. They are teaching the children. They are washing the clothes. But how to quantify it, how to digitize it, and how to monetize it? This has not been discussed.
बस आप लोग बस आते हैं, सबके पास आते हैं। देखिए हम लोग लंच का टाइम बढ़ा देंगे, कोई चिंता की बात नहीं है। लेकिन आप ये अब 5 मेल हो गए, फिर हम फीमेल पे पूछेंगे।
Sir, just a second. I just want to mention one point.
Type.
Sorry.
आप पूछ रहे हैं भैया, प्लीज गो।
Yeah. Sir, please. Sir, myself, Dr. Ambarish Gautam. I'm assistant professor in Amity University, Jharkhand. Very good afternoon to all. My one query, one suggestion, which is here. Specifically, whatever we have discussed about the non-recognition of the women's work. So in that condition, although we couldn't say that the women are not working, they are working continuously, exhaustively. The entire work, entire household activities are directly dependent over them. So my one suggestion is, can we develop one model of recognition of the women work in the form of the equity grant formation at the household level? Equity grant means the work which they did, whatever either they have washed the cloth or they have cooked the food, whatever things they did, that will include one equity as per their work. This is my suggestion. Can be. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I have one very simple question, and this is a kind of observation which I have made it recent days regarding today's topic. Madam, you mentioned that technology has really bringing change the gap we have, and especially I'm talking about the tribal community and rural community. Now, I could see because of the introduction of the small technology also in the rural area, even less educated and uneducated farmers are also using the technology, and that they are sharing that together, men and women. Especially, I have seen some of the women, the girls, they're cycling and also driving the scooty and motorbike, and they are also taking the necessary material like manure to the field on cycle. Even otherwise there was the head load and also the bhar and so on. But now they are using that technology. Both the young men and women farmers, they are using the scooty and cycle and also the rickshaw. So this one thing I see, if the technology is developed and made the farmers friendly, people friendly, I think this will definitely bring change. Thank you. And
second round, third round, yeah, Mike. के बाद लास्ट राउंड होगा जिसपे मेल फीमेल कोई भी पूछ सकते हैं 5, 6, 7 क्वेश्चन तक.
Thank you. These are very interesting questions, also very difficult questions. Okay. So let me again start with the last one. Okay. Yes, you're very right that, when technology is developed, is easily accessible, available, people will use it. It doesn't matter whether it's men or women. What we really need to do is make sure that through the introduction of the technology, we don't create new inequalities. Okay, so to make sure that technology is sort of given, made accessible in a way that's available to all social classes and both men and women. The two questions by Dr. Ambrish and Dr. Hussain are very relative. Okay, essentially they both basically relate to the fact that how do we pay people for the domestic activities that they are doing. You know, there has been a movement, and I think Kamal Hussain has certainly come out with this major argument that we should be providing wages for housework. Okay, I I have to say that I see certain social class biases involved in it if we are talking about paying for housework, because essentially the money will have to be coming from somewhere to the government, and then it is being distributed to the households. The idea that if you are paying for housework for certain kinds of activity, working women will be paying for the reimbursement to the non-working women, it just gets very complicated. I think perhaps what we should stay with is more simpler thinking about some of the basic grants to the households rather than this very complex reimbursement for cooking, cleaning, whatever else. I should say, though, the funny story on it is was I had heard about from an Iranian women's movement, where there was an argument that was being made that at the time of the divorce, women were only entitled to the meher that was promised. Okay? So to make sure that they got sufficient maintenance, the argument was made was that women were not obligated to do the housework that they had done during their marriage, and they should get reimbursed for it. That was kind of an interesting argument. To go to Dr. Jyoti Prakash, who mentioned we are ignoring in this presentation people 15 to 24. I absolutely believe it. I think I definitely focused on working age, which I took to be 25, so that I statistically didn't have to deal with the complications of modeling people who are in school or college versus people who are in the workforce. But that is definitely an important area to look at. And I actually think there is a lot of gender inequality in there as well, because the number of girls who are in NEET category, neither employed in training in labor force, is actually pretty large. I think Dr. Mahato had a question about handloom. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about the way industries organized to be able to respond to it sensibly, but I'm hoping somebody else would be able to respond to it better than I can. And I think there was another question about cultural, Mr. Chintan, I think, cultural and social norms and education. You know, I sort of think that what we need is a transformation of the society on two fronts. One front is making sure that there are enough jobs available that are not discriminatory, that make space for women, and ensure that these women at the middle level of education who are being left out are able to gain those access and opportunities. The second front is a sort of a focus on cultural and social norms. My fear has been that a focus on social norms and cultural norms tends to absolve the policy and society from making some of the investment in economic opportunities and some of the more institutional changes. Because we always say, हाँ हाँ हमारी society में ऐसा ही होता है, हमें लोगों को समझाना है, सिखाना है. But that becomes a sort of this amorphous action to be done someday, rather than something that needs to be done immediately and urgently. And that's the reason I focus on opportunities rather than norms change. Thank you.
थैंक यू. अभी आते हैं एक राउंड और, लेकिन आप लोग जितने बैठे हैं उससे ज्यादा ऑनलाइन लोग पार्टिसिपेट कर रहे हैं, उनके साथ कुछ जस्टिस करना है. तो मैं 3-4 क्वेश्चंस इस राउंड में आई विल पुट टू हर फ्रॉम ऑनलाइन. What is a question from Jayasri Indra Raman? What is the major shift in women's participation post-COVID pandemic? Has it started showing the pre-COVID numbers or not? So major shift in after COVID. Then the second question is from Narayan Singh Rao. do you agree that there would be some methodological issues and lacunas in the sample surveys? That is why women's participation in labor force is shown as reduced or stagnating. So question related to sample, surveys, methodology and all that. Then I have picked up five questions. So this is third question is from Shamini. Is our gig platform women workers are being counted in the PLFS data? Gig and platform workers, women workers are being counted in the PLFS surveys. The supplementary question is, can the women labor force participation be increased through new platform? This is a very topical issue. Then we have a question by Professor T.C.A. Anant. He says, it may be worth looking at age group wise participation rate. Women labor force participation rate rises after age 35 or so. Changes in this due to decline in fertility. Fertility may explain, changes in the decline in fertility may explain some changes. Probably you may shed some light. And then we have two more questions. Dr. Ragini Sahai, a large section of urban educated women employed in diverse roles. However, there has also been declining trend in workforce participation because of childbirth, career break, etc. Also, women in many organizations do feel discriminated. They face discriminatory practices in terms of wages, unsafe environment, sexual harassment at workplaces, and they prefer to leave the job. So she wants your comment on that. Then the last question on this, Professor Ritu Diwan, she is asking, could the issue of women's workforce participation be better explained by linking with growth patterns and policies that are increasingly de-linked from employment? For example, she's saying capital-intensive technologies. So after this response, I will again come to one more round. After that, there won't be any round.
Okay. I think Professor Diwan's question is really central. Could we try to think in terms of sort of big secular changes of what is happening to overall employment, not just women's employment? And yes, I think that if there is a greater expansion of paid work and employment, it would make a huge difference. I think it would make a difference for men and it would make a difference for women, because we clearly have a lot of underemployment of men also in India. So secular policies are extremely important from that perspective. I think Ragini Sahaya asked, whether there is a sort of the whole issue of workplace constraints, safety, discrimination, and so on. I couldn't agree more with you. There is actually quite a bit of a research showing that women who live in areas where there is a greater physical safety, public safety, tend to be far more likely to participate in the labor force than in areas where there isn't. So those remain very important issues. TC, Anant, I think I love that question. I think that this is an analysis that needs to be done by looking for different age groups, correlating it with the fertility trends and so on. One of our challenges, however, is that the data that we need to do that happen to be only the NSS and PLFS data. And as I have just mentioned, I'm deeply concerned about the quality of these data sets. So I'm hoping that we can also invest in improvement of the data while we are also disaggregating some of these trends, particularly because I think that with changing fertility, unless your data actually tell you how many children this woman has, we may not be, or and their ages, we would have a very hard time doing our analysis. PLFS currently contains so few independent variables that we can use that some of this analysis would be very difficult to do. I think there were several other very interesting questions. One related to gig workers and whether platform work provides an opportunity to increase women's labor force participation. I think platform work provides an opportunities to increase women's labor force participation. It also provides an opportunities for exploitation. Okay? And I believe that we need to understand both of those simultaneously to be able to ensure that these opportunities are non-exploitative. Because even before the gig work actually and platform work became famous, we have had plenty of work on women handicraft workers who actually produce at home, that is purchased by a middleman and then it is sold. And the middleman makes enormous amount of profit. The women, particularly women who are more constrained in the household, don't have very many options in terms of going out and selling it themselves. So some of the craft facilitation work that was being done had great opportunity. So market-based platform work versus craft facilitation centers, which are more cooperative in nature, is something we would need to think about. Mr. Rao had asked whether there would be some methodological issues in sample surveys. And I actually think that sample survey techniques are very fairly well developed, but there is certainly methodological issues in terms of how these questions are asked, framed, and how we train our interviewers, as I think I began my presentation that way. Okay? And I think what Jyotsna asked, or Jayashri, I apologize, asked what happened post-COVID to women's labor force participation. And yes, it remains a very interesting question. I don't think I have very good data for you, but I do remember the articles that were being written during COVID, where we had assumed that India would follow the international experience where there would be much greater drop in women's labor force participation than in men's, and we did not see it. Okay. And the reason we did not see it was that there were so few women in wage labor. It was the wage labor and small businesses which were shutting down, and it affected men much more, whereas women's work was mainly focused in self-employment in agricultural sector, which was much less affected. Thank you.
There has been, I think, 2/3 of the increase in women's employment has been in rural areas, and of course, they have been in agriculture and other subsistence sector. Yeah, so this is the last round. Yeah, Tanushree, we start.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Dr. Tanushree Kundu. I'm assistant professor at the Central University of Jharkhand, and formerly and currently also I'm a visiting fellow with IHD. I would like to add on to the sociology of urban women, highly educated urban women staying out of the workforce. So we did a small study among the metropolitan women who belong to the cohort of higher education group, college and above, who stayed out of the formal workforce due to various factors, including one factor that I would like to point out here is lack of flexibility in work conditions or working hours in the formal work market. So that was one condition that they specially pointed out. And there we found two instances where there was an steady increase in the women workers in formal work market. One was during the COVID lockdown and few years after the COVID lockdown, wherein flexible work conditions were provided to the women in the form of work from home and work from remote locations, wherein women preferred, especially the urban women, highly educated cohort, they preferred to work in formal market because they had flexible working hours. also there's another instance of women who were never part of the formal workforce. They have started entering the work market in the form of being self-employed in the form of digital content creators in the various social media platforms. So because that is providing a kind of flexible work conditions and working hours, these women are preferring these kind of work markets, whether they are getting counted in the formal work service, NSS surveys or not. But there has been a steady increase among especially the higher educated women workers in the urban areas entering these kind of workforce. So just in addition to the sociology of the women workers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Dr. Arun Kumar from IIM Ranchi. So my question is more on like, is there any comparative advantage of females in some of the areas? So like, so which can be explained by not the socioeconomic attributes. So like instead of traditions and that all, it may be because of comparative advantage which females might be having in some areas. So they work more in that areas. So is there any possibility of that? And if it is there, then from the policy perspective, should the government focus on more on the industries in which females have more comparative advantage, like for example, IT, education, banking and finance, compared to transportation and that all? Or should the government focus equally on all the industries for increasing their workforce participation?
Just a minute, just a minute.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sweta Kumari from Sarla Birla University. I wanted to know that according to presented data, percentage participation of women labor force has declined. But is the actual figure also declined? If not, how do we consider it for overall unemployment? If not, how we can consider it from overall unemployment?
Myself, Dr. Sunita Purti, independent researcher, Jharkhand. Thank you, Professor Desai, for this insightful lecture. This is my reflection. This is very important issue. Rising education level associated with the lower work on farm in a rural area. So I would like to share, not whole Jharkhand, the West Singhbhum. I belong to the West Singhbhum district of Jharkhand. So the women in my district, basically the tribal women who are graduate or postgraduate, due to not having sufficient job opportunity, these rural women who are educated, instead of choosing or remain in village or engage in informal sector of agriculture, they choose to migrate in Bangalore, Chennai, Delhi for work in the manufacturing industries like clothing or fishery industries. So this is like and they engaged in those industries, and they work longer hour and get the very minimum wage. These issues need to be addressed while we talking about the formal or informal economy and women participation.
Thank you. You have conveyed.
Thank you.
I request everybody to be very brief now. Already it is going to be 1:30 and you must be hungry. Yeah.
Thank you. My short submission only. So in preview of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry. Myself, Rajesh Ranjan. I'm Assistant Director from Mamta Health Institute for Mother and Child. So in preview of Sustainable Development Goals, the points are very well raised there also. My submission is that in your opinion, what should be your suggestion, what opinion, what the course of discussion should be in the coming 10 years? What you will suggest in terms of the policy level it should be included in the Indian context?
Thank you. Yeah. इनको दीजिए हाँ.
Good afternoon to everyone and Johar to everyone. I am Arvind Bhagat, research scholar, Department of Political Science, Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar Institute, Lucknow. So I have few questions. The first is your study includes the inequality based on caste and caste? Because in recent study I have studied that there is a place called Obra Panchayat in UP, Obra Panchayat in UP, and women are asked for favor as a sex in that panchayat in getting jobs for road constructions. This is my first. So, do we have data on different caste and sex based or different caste lines? Okay. So, okay, thank you.
Hello.
No other question now. Thank you.
फर्स्ट थैंक यू मैम, क्योंकि मैंने भी थोड़ा बहुत मेरा नाम इंदल कुमार है, मैं सरला बिरला यूनिवर्सिटी में असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर हूँ एंड मैं ग्लैड हूँ कि मैंने भी थोड़ा बहुत आईडीज पे काम किया है. मेरा क्वेश्चन था कि मैम ये जो सोशल नॉर्म्स का है जो यू शेप शो कर रहा है वीमेन लेबर फोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन, क्या ये नॉर्डिक कंट्रीज में भी है? क्योंकि वहाँ सोशलाइजेशन हमारे यहाँ जैसा नहीं है संस्कृताइजेशन, तो क्या वहाँ भी इस तरह का वीमेन लेबर फोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन शो कर रहा है? और दो थे मैम, दो अदर को रिलेट कर सकते हैं. एक बताया था स्ट्रीम सिलेक्शन का, आपने एजुकेशन को लिया है और लेबर फोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन आप उसका प्रिडिक्टिव वैल्यू जो भी आप दिखा रहे हैं, तो क्या स्ट्रीम सिलेक्शन वाइज भी अगर ये जो स्लाइड्स में आपका नहीं था ऐसा कुछ स्टडी होगा तो कृपया उस पर एडिशनल इन्फॉर्मेशन दे तो अच्छा होगा. दूसरा जो कास्ट की बात ऑलरेडी कर रहे थे, तो मेरा एक कंसर्न है कि उसमें ये जो राइजिंग वीमेन फोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन हो रहा है ड्यू टू राइज इन एजुकेशन, तो वे अगर जो लेबर फोर्स में पार्टिसिपेट करते हैं तो उनके बिहाफ पे जो हाउस होल्ड वर्क है उनको रिप्लेस कौन कर रहा है? वे क्या वीमेन ही रिप्लेस करते हैं ऑफ द सेम कास्ट और क्लास और डिफरेंट?
So now there won't be any question, but I have two more questions online, which I will add with this round. One is by Sajaya Dangwar. She is Deputy Manager, Watershed Organization Trust. Her question is whether bringing gender parity can be achieved only by engaging women in self-help groups. But there is no strategy in place to engage men into the discussion on gender parity and how we can have more shared responsibility in the household and outside, about which John also mentioned. This is an important question. It has been discussed. And then there is a question by Dr. Ratan Kanbasosis. He asks, he's in Calcutta, he asks, labor force participation of women is increasing according to PLFS data. But that is in area of self-employment. Why so? Yeah, now.
I think I discussed early on that PLFS labor force participation increase might well be due to measurement issues. So I'll not expand on that. I think bringing men into discussion on gender is absolutely essential. I don't believe that we can do it all with women alone. Clearly, that remains an important area. But I also think that I sort of believe with Abigail Adams that, all men would be tyrants if they could be allowed. So I believe that increasing women's bargaining power to ensure that their spouses participate equally into the household work is important. There were two questions around sort of caste inequality, and I'll club them together. I do believe that gender is just one part of an unequal social institutions that we live in. And women of particular caste, class groups can be far more vulnerable than men of the same groups and women of the upper caste and upper class categories. And in fact, one of the most interesting things that we see in India, and actually, which is a good thing to know, is that very high women coming from extremely high income strata actually have managed to make professional strides. After all, there were large number of bank CEOs who were women. So clearly, the social class plays an important role in supporting women's ability to make those high strides and achievements. However, that work is supported by other working women who come from a very different social class. There was a sort of question on SDGs and what your suggestions would be. I think as I started, I probably have more questions than answers, but I would say that a couple of areas in which I would love to see some changes made and would be dealing with, to some extent, working on reducing occupational segregation in government jobs. I'm not even talking about private sector. I'm not talking about anything else, but I would love to see government jobs be a little more open to women in a variety of positions. And again, not through quota, just making sure that you are not being biased. Okay. Then there were some questions about tribal women who migrate rather than continue to work on the farms. No, I guess I am a little bit nervous about sort of talking about farm work as the be all end all, or that no migration should take place. I think we are moving in a world where people will move to wherever there are jobs, and whether it be men or women. What we would like to be able to do is that migration be voluntary, be safe, be remunerative. And I would say managing migration rather than preventing it would be something to think about. Then there was a question about unemployment. Okay? And I think that unemployment is an issue. It's often in women's case, kind of a disguised unemployment, because it's not very clear that they're officially looking for jobs, so your official statistics may not capture it. But as we see, when opportunities expand, women take it up. So clearly there is a fair amount of pent-up demand for work. And the final question, I think, was something to do with highly educated women being left out. And I think it was Dr. Tanushri who mentioned it. Yes, it's a very interesting question. That it's one of the things that I had noticed was I had read a very interesting paper in the US that among the different ethnic groups, Indian women have actually one of the lowest labor force participation rates in spite of extremely high education. And I believe that variety of factors pay into it, but certainly our valorization of childcare and sort of a mother's investment in children, or what I had mentioned as intensive parenting or concerted cultivation, is one of those things. But it's not only Indian women, it's also happening in Korea, in other parts of East Asia. So it's fairly clear that for very highly educated women who have the option of staying at home versus working, creating home-based work opportunities would be important. But I would say that I tend to focus a lot more on the bottom of the pyramid rather than the top of the pyramid. That's where my heart goes out. So let me focus there. Thank you.
Friends, you will agree with me that this has been a fascinating lecture and equally fascinating, very intensive discussion. If you count online, 4-5 rounds have taken place, something like 25-30 questions, and she responded so well. A lot of interest in Jharkhand people on this issue. On Sunday, so much discussion, nearly 45 to 50 minutes discussion after the lecture. Her lecture was also 45 minutes and discussions also 45. So it shows the interest. So now lunch is waiting for you. I won't disrupt. Thank you very much, Priyanka.
Yes, sir, I'll just take 30 seconds more. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure all of you have enjoyed this very interesting lecture by Professor Sonalde Desai, which has formed part of the Silver Jubilee celebrations of IHD. I take this opportunity to express my heartfelt thanks to Professor Desai for delivering such a profound, a very insightful lecture, and more so informative and engaging. This calls for a big round of applause, everyone sitting here. Thank you. Sincere thanks to Professor John Reyes for sharing his valuable comments on the topic and, of course, raising several questions. So thank you, John, for your comments. The success of this event is owed to the dedicated teams of IHD Eastern Regional Center that have coordinated the communications and administration led by Dr. Ashwani Kumar. If he's around, there he is. Faculty at IHD RCU deserves a big round of applause. He has been supported by Dr. Devika Modi, Mr. Biken Singh, Mr. Amit Kumar, Ms. Avanti Soumya, our friend Kundanji. There was another friend of ours who was helping us with the mics. All of you deserve a big round of applause. Thank you so much. Purushottam and Kundam who helped us with the mics. Thank you so much. Special mention to Rajiv Ranjan, who has been taking us all around the city and bringing people to the venue. And my colleague from Delhi who has come, Mr. Vikas Dubey, who's a researcher at IHD, we have been working 1 year, 2 more lectures, and just one more event to go. Vikas, we will do the hybrid much better. And we did it here as well. So thank you, Vikas. What would we do without you? Thanks to the camera team, lights team, sound team, everyone here, the skipper for the venue and the Kaveri for the caterers. I would like to say a big thank you to Professor Ramesh Saran, under whose supervision all these preparations of the event were done, and also shared such insightful opening remarks, which actually set the tone and temper of the lecture also that followed. We sincerely hope that under his leadership, our center will flourish further. Finally, I would like to say a big thank you to Professor Alakin Sharma, the director of IHD, the person who chaired and moderated this lecture, also played a pivotal role as the architect of this event. Like in the past, he has continued to guide and coordinate our efforts, resulting in yet another successful event. We are truly thankful to you, sir. And now I will not stand between lunch and you. Lunch is served. Please join us for lunch. Thank you. And do keep joining us for our conferences and lectures. Thank you very much. A group photograph, please.